All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. We're diving into chapter 44 of the Built for God BFG movement handbook, the Christian edition.
Okay.
And this chapter, it's all about this idea of spiritual wealth. And reading through it, I don't know about you, but it kind of got me thinking about, what are my priorities?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the handbook talks about this whole goal of like restoring the truth, right? And when you look at this chapter, about spiritual wealth, it really kind of forces you to confront those big questions, like what really matters in the long run.
Right.
Is it all about like being popular and having everyone know your name? Or is it about something deeper, like that inner compass that kind of guides you? And then there's the whole thing about like material stuff versus like your inner self, right? Mm-hmm. And how do we deal with all the ups and downs of life, the good times and the bad times, and still find some kind of peace?
Yeah. And it's really interesting to think about this chapter within the context of, the whole handbook, right? Mm. Because it covers a huge range of stuff. Like, 1 minute it's talking about the mysteries of God, and then the next it's like, give you practical tips for like living simply.
Right.
So this chapter, it's like one piece of this much bigger puzzle, and the questions it asks, man, they're pretty profound.
Yeah.
Like it straight up asks you, is being famous more valuable than like truly knowing who you are?
Yeah.
Does having a ton of stuff like outweigh the health of your soul, And when things are constantly changing in your life, what kind of gain or loss really hits you the hardest? Like, that's deep stuff, man.
It is. And I think what's great about this chapter, though, is that it doesn't just kind of leave you hanging with these big, like, philosophical questions. It actually gives you this framework for how to work through them. It's called renewal.
Yeah.
And it breaks it down into 3 parts: mindset, aim, and practice. And then after that, there's this whole section called Respond, which it looks at how all these ideas kind of connect with like the wisdom of different traditions from all over the world.
Right.
So we're going to kind of weave all of that into our conversation today. So it's not just about thinking about these ideas, but also like how they might actually play out in your life,
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's jump into this mindset thing, because that's like the foundation of everything. And the first point that really stood out to me was, this whole idea of valuing yourself more than fame. Like really focusing on that inner integrity, that quiet sense of who you are deep down inside, rather than, chasing after the approval of other people, which, let's be honest, can be pretty fickle sometimes.
Yeah. Totally. And what's so powerful about that is that like it's not just some new agey self-help thing. It points to Mark 8:3-6, which says, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" That's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's deep.
It really makes you think about like, where are you putting your energy? Mm-hmm. Are you trying to get everyone to like you, which, let's face it, never really lasts? Or are you investing in something like way more meaningful within yourself?
Like, where are you finding your sense of security,
Yeah, exactly.
And this is really challenging, in a world where everyone's constantly comparing themselves to others, like on social media and stuff. The handbook is saying, hey, your true worth, it doesn't come from how many likes you get or say about you online. Like, it's suggesting that your value comes from somewhere much deeper, like a connection to something beyond yourself. It's like it flips the script on how we usually think about our identity.
And that kind of leads to the next mindset shift, which is about really treasuring your inner self, like the spiritual core you were talking about, more than just accumulating like a bunch of material wealth. Mm-hmm. It's that age-old question of like, what really makes you feel fulfilled?
Yeah.
Is it all the stuff you own, or is it the person you're becoming on the inside?
Yeah.
And the handbook, it brings up Matthew 6.21, which says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Like, that really hits home,
It does. And it really makes you think about like, okay, how am I actually living my life? Are my choices, like how I spend my money, how I spend my time, do they actually reflect what I truly care about deep down? Or am I just caught in this trap of like always wanting more, thinking that the next thing I buy or the next achievement is going to like finally make me happy.
Yeah, that's so common though, right?
It is. It is.
Like we're constantly bombarded with messages telling us that we need more stuff, more experiences, to be happy. And this chapter really forces you to like examine that. And that kind of leads into the next point, which is about approaching both the good times and the tough times, the gains and the losses with a sense of like evenness. And it's not about like pretending that the hard stuff doesn't hurt,
Right.
but more about learning to like navigate those ups and downs with a kind of fundamental trust that there's a bigger picture, a bigger plan. And the Handbook brings in Philippians 4, where Paul talks about learning to be content, like no matter what's going on. How do you think that kind of like inner stability, might change how you react to things in your daily life?
It's about finding that stillness inside so that you're not like completely thrown off balance every time something good or bad happens. The BFG perspective is encouraging us to be grateful, not just when things are going great, but also in those tough moments, because maybe they're part of something bigger that we don't quite understand yet.
Exactly. And that ties directly into this idea of not getting too attached to like material things.
Right.
The Handbook, it really warns against like loving your possessions too much.
Yeah.
And it reminds us of Matthew 6, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal.
That verse, it always makes me think about how temporary everything really is.
It does.
Like all the stuff we work so hard for, it can all be gone in an instant. And this part of the chapter, it's really asking you to take a hard look at yourself and be like, okay, is there anything I'm holding on to so tightly that it might actually be like blocking my spiritual growth?
Right.
Or maybe even creating like unnecessary stress and worry in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And from that idea of like letting go of stuff, we kind of move into this idea of cultivating contentment in what the Handbook calls God's provision. It's about finding that peace and satisfaction in what you already have, instead of always focusing on what you don't have.
Right.
And the Handbook, it uses 1 Timothy 6.67, which says, but godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. What do you make of that?
It's so powerful, right? Like it really makes you shift your perspective.
Yeah.
It's like an invitation to practice gratitude every day, to really notice and appreciate all the good things that are already in your life. It's like the opposite of that feeling of like never having enough.
It is. And then the final mindset shift that this chapter talks about is the importance of knowing when to stop and be satisfied. It's about recognizing that point of like enough. And it quotes Ecclesiastes 4.6 here, which says, better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind.
That imagery, man, one handful with tranquility versus two handfuls with like constant striving. That's powerful.
It is.
It really makes you think about like, okay, where in my life could I maybe benefit from a little more moderation? Like where could I recognize that I have enough and just like chill out a bit?
Absolutely. So we've talked about these like really important shifts in mindset, right? And what's cool here is that like each of those mindset principles, it kind of leads directly to a corresponding aim,
Right.
And these aims, they're presented as like active intentions that you can like adopt in your own life. So it's not just about like thinking differently, but it's about actually like directing your energy in a specific way.
Yeah, it's like taking those ways of thinking and turning them into like deliberate goals.
Exactly.
So for example, if the mindset is about valuing your inner self over fame, the corresponding aim would be to really cherish that inner identity, to prioritize who you are at your core over like seeking validation from other people. And that goes back to that wisdom from Mark 8.36, right?
Exactly. And then when we think about that idea of treasuring your inner self over material wealth, the aim then becomes to like intentionally prioritize your spiritual wealth,
Right.
like those inner qualities and that connection to something bigger than yourself.
Right.
And that aligns with what we were talking about in Matthew 6.19-20.
Exactly. And that mindset of approaching gain and loss with like a sense of equanimity, that translates into the aim of really embracing those natural cycles of life with faith and trust, kind of like the story of Job in Job 1.21.
Exactly. And that principle of not getting too attached to material things, that leads to the aim of consciously detaching from that excessive love of possessions, right?
Yeah.
And we can use Matthew 6.21 as a guide for that.
And then cultivating contentment in, God's provision becomes the active aim of seeking that godliness, that inner connection, along with a deep sense of contentment.
Exactly. And that wisdom of knowing when to stop and find satisfaction, that becomes the aim of recognizing when you have enough and choosing to rest and find peace in God's provision.
Yeah.
Which echoes that beautiful invitation in Matthew 11.28.
And there's this additional aim that's introduced, this idea of like looking beyond just the temporary ups and downs of life and setting your sights on like eternal joy.
Wow.
And it draws inspiration from Colossians 3.2. And it really like broadens the whole perspective. It's not just about this life, but about something much bigger. So like, how does that idea of an eternal perspective change how you prioritize things in the present?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really makes you think about like what truly matters, you know? If this life isn't all there is, then maybe some of those things that seem so important right now, you know, they kind of lose their grip on you a little bit.
Yeah.
And it gives a deeper meaning to all those other aims, you know, it connects them to a much bigger purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. So the chapter is basically encouraging us to really think about how embracing these aims could actually like change our everyday choices.
Exactly. Exactly. And that leads us very naturally to the section on practice. Because, you know, it's one thing to have a new way of thinking, to set these great intentions, but like the real transformation happens when we actually start living these ideas in our daily lives. So the BFG Handbook, it takes each of those aims and it turns it into a tangible practice, something you can actually do. It's about moving from like theory to action.
Yeah, it's what taking those kind of abstract concepts and making them real in your everyday life.
Exactly. Exactly. So, for instance, that aim of cherishing your inner identity over seeking fame, that becomes the practice of humility. It's about actively valuing who you are on the inside, regardless of whether other people recognize it or not. And Galatians 1.10, it reminds us of that. What do you think that might look like in like your everyday interactions with people?
Yeah, I mean, it's about not needing to be the center of attention all the time, It's about letting others shine.
Yeah.
It's about like genuinely celebrating their successes without feeling threatened.
Yeah, exactly. And then that aim of prioritizing spiritual wealth over material wealth, that translates into the practice of generosity. It's about like actively sharing your resources, whether it's your time, your talents, or your possessions. And, that reflects the principles in Matthew 6.19-20.
Exactly. And that mindset of approaching gain and loss with equanimity, that becomes the practice of resilience.
Yeah.
It's about consciously choosing to trust that there's a bigger plan at play,
Right.
And finding strength in all circumstances, kind of like Job did in Job 1.21.
Exactly. So like, how can you actually cultivate that kind of inner resilience, when you're facing those challenges in life?
Yeah, I mean, it's about not letting those setbacks completely crush you.
Right.
It's about learning from them, growing from them.
Yeah, yeah.
And trusting that like you'll come out stronger on the other side.
Exactly. And that aim of detaching from excessive love for material things, that becomes the practice of detachment itself. It's about like making choices to limit your desires,
Right.
And not letting your possessions define who you are. And we can look to Matthew 6.21 for guidance on that. So like, what are some small steps that you think people could take towards greater detachment?
Yeah, I mean, it could be as simple as like decluttering your home, getting rid of things you don't really need or use.
Yeah.
It could be about like resisting the urge to buy the latest gadget or like the newest fashion trend.
Right.
It's about like shifting your focus away from those external things and towards like what truly matters.
Exactly. And that idea of seeking godliness with contentment, that becomes a practice of really nurturing that inner connection, that sense of righteousness in your everyday life.
Right.
So what are some practices that help you personally cultivate that inner sense of peace and purpose?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's definitely things like prayer and meditation, spending time in nature, like quieting my mind and connecting with something larger than myself. And that aim of recognizing when you have enough and choosing to rest, that becomes the practice of moderation.
Right.
It's about being aware of your limits and intentionally creating space for rest and rejuvenation, just like Matthew 11.28 invites us to do. So, like, where in your life do you think a little more moderation could bring you more peace?
I think for me, it's about like setting boundaries around work. making sure I'm not always plugged in, always available.
Right.
It's about like giving myself permission to disconnect and recharge.
Yeah, that's so important.
It is. It is. And then finally, that aim of looking towards eternal joy, that transforms into the practice of spiritual awareness. It's about actively focusing your attention on those like eternal truths, rather than getting caught up in all the fleeting temporary pleasures of this world. And Colossians 3.2 kind of hints at that. So like, how do you cultivate a greater awareness of that spiritual dimension in your daily life?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's about being present, like really paying attention to the little things.
Yeah.
The beauty of nature, the kindness of strangers. It's about finding moments of awe and wonder throughout the day.
I love that. And what's so helpful is that the handbook, it doesn't just like list these practices and then leave you hanging, It actually gives you like specific examples for each one, like really concrete, actionable things you can do. So it's not just like, okay, here's a concept, good luck figuring it out. Okay, here are some actual steps you can take to make this happen.
Yeah, it makes it so much easier to like actually start integrating these ideas into your life.
Exactly. It really bridges that gap between like understanding something and actually living it out.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the final section of this chapter's framework, which is respond. And this is where the BFG handbook, it kind of takes these core principles of spiritual wealth and it connects them with like the wisdom of different faith traditions from all over the world.
Yeah, and this is really fascinating, because like it's showing how these ideas aren't just limited to one way of thinking or believing.
Right.
It's like it's fostering this sense of like shared human wisdom.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, we're all on this journey together and we can learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So for each of the key themes we've been talking about, inner identity, spiritual riches, accepting change, all that good stuff, the handbook, it presents its perspective, the BFG perspective, but then it also offers parallel teachings from Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And it often uses like specific quotes from their scriptures or texts.
Yeah, it's like finding these echoes of truth in all these different cultures and traditions,
It is. And what's really striking is like this underlying message of unity.
Yeah.
Like, for example, when the handbook talks about valuing your inner identity over fame, alongside that verse from Mark, it also brings in a verse from the Quran 17.37, which says, it advises against walking proudly on the earth and emphasizes that like true honor comes from faith. And it also touches on the Bhagavad Gita's teachings about the importance of inner discipline and the Buddhist understanding of like how impermanent worldly recognition really is.
Right.
So like, what do you think these parallels tell us about like the human search for meaning and value?
Yeah. I mean, it really highlights that there's this common thread running through all these different spiritual traditions. Deep down, we're all searching for the same thing.
We are. And then when we look at that idea of prioritizing spiritual riches over material wealth, we see Matthew 6.19-20 alongside a verse from the Quran 30.39, which is about giving with the intention of like pleasing God.
Right.
And then there's the Hindu concept of selfless service. And the Dhammapada, it has these verses about the dangers of being too attached to wealth, and the real treasures that are found in your heart.
And then when it comes to embracing those gains and losses with faith, you have Job 1.21 alongside a verse from the Quran 94.5, which talks about how ease always comes after hardship. And the Bhagavad Gita's teachings on maintaining that equanimity in the face of like all the ups and downs of life and the Buddhist understanding of impermanence as like a fundamental truth of reality.
Yeah. And then that theme of not getting too attached to material possessions, which is so clear in Matthew 6.21, it finds echoes in Islamic teachings about like resisting the allure of worldly things.
Right.
And the Hindu principle of non-possessiveness, which is called a parigraha. And in Buddhism, the second noble truth, it identifies attachment as like a root cause of suffering.
And that pursuit of contentment in godliness, which is encouraged in 1 Timothy 6.6, it finds parallels in the Islamic concept of being satisfied with what God provides. It's called qanat. And the Hindu virtue of contentment, which is santosha. And the Buddhist principle of finding joy in simplicity, which is called santuti.
I love how all these different words for contentment, they all point to the same basic idea.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
And even that idea of knowing when to rest and be satisfied, it finds common ground in Matthew 11.28 and the Islamic emphasis on balance and avoiding excess.
Right.
And the Hindu practice of yoga, which is all about like inner harmony and the Buddhist middle way, which encourages us to avoid extremes.
And lastly, that focus on eternal joy over temporary satisfaction, which we see in Colossians 3.2, it connects with verses from the Quran that describe the rewards of the afterlife and the Hindu concept of liberation, which is called moksha, and the Buddhist goal of nirvana.
So, like, what do you think it means that all these different traditions, they all seem to point to something beyond just this material world?
I think it speaks to like a deep longing that we all have, for something more, something that lasts.
It's like it's woven into our very being.
Yeah. And what really stands out to me from all these parallels is that across all these diverse traditions, there's this consistent emphasis on like cultivating your inner values, pursuing spiritual growth, and on not letting yourself get totally consumed by material things.
Right.
It's a really powerful, unifying perspective.
It is. In the handbook, it even gives a real-world application for each of these parallels.
Yeah.
It's encouraging like interfaith understanding and actually putting these shared values into practice in our daily interactions.
Right.
So it's not just about like intellectually recognizing these similarities, but it's about actually like living them out together.
Yeah. Comes back to that quote that's highlighted in the Respond section. It's attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas, and it says, "Truth cannot contradict truth." And it really frames this idea that at their core, all these different wisdom traditions, they often point to the same fundamental truths about what it means to be human and about how to live a good life.
Yeah. So as we wrap up our deep dive into chapter 44, it really all circles back to that main message. True, lasting wealth. It's not about fame or fortune. It's about what's inside of us.
Right.
It's about cultivating our inner being and connecting with something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And, as we've been talking about all this, I hope you, our listeners, have been thinking about those initial questions we posed,
Yeah.
about like, is fame more valuable than knowing your true self? Does having a lot of stuff outweigh the health of your soul? How do we deal with those gains and losses in life? Like, what really hits us the hardest? I hope that everything we've talked about today, about those shifts in mindset, the intentions we set, the practices we can do, and those amazing parallels across different faiths, has given you some new insights to consider.
Yeah, and it really raises an important question for you to think about. How might your understanding of spiritual wealth and even your connection to other people be changed by recognizing these shared values across different spiritual traditions? Like, that's something to really sit with.
It is. It is.
And if this deep dive into chapter 44 has like sparked your interest, we definitely recommend checking out some of the other chapters in the BFG handbook.
Yeah, it's a treasure trove of wisdom.
Like we mentioned at the beginning, it covers so many different topics, and each chapter offers a unique perspective on your spiritual journey.
So yeah, definitely dive in and see what resonates with you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.